the humid, fetid air of Quito, Guadalcanal. In the dying months of 1942, hung heavy with the smell of death, rot, and the peculiar metallic scent of exposed coral. But to Vice Sergeant Major Kenjiro Tanaka, it was simply the air of duty. Deep within the tangled, steaming jungle, Tanaka tightened the puttees around his ankles, preparing for the inevitable. Around him, a handful of men, ghosts with sunken eyes and skin stretched taut over sharp bone, finished their final preparations. Their discipline was absolute, their starvation irrelevant. They carried the spiritual weight of an entire empire, their meager, rusting Fort Type 99 rifles, and fixed bayonets representing not just weaponry, but the doctrine of the invincible spirit. The uncompromising belief that sheer, unyielding will could and must conquer the harsh material arithmetic of the enemy. Tanaka had seen the American foe. He had heard the deafening, constant thunderclap of their artillery. He had watched the endless procession of their transport ships, monstrous shapes that disgorged men and machinery with a reckless, almost insulting abundance. But his training, his soul, and the voice of the Emperor told him that these were merely the trappings of a soft, materialistic society. The Americans were soulless ogres, monsters consumed by greed, incapable of withstanding the pure, fanatical courage of the true warrior. Surrender was not merely dishonorable, it was unimaginable, for the propaganda promised a fate of systematic torture and humiliation at the hands of these comfort-addicted demons. Tanaka, a veteran of the brutal campaigns in China, was an anchor for this ideology, a man whose worldview was built entirely upon the Bushido code, a structure of iron loyalty where death in service was the only acceptable conclusion. This certainty, however, stood on a foundation of sand, the spiritual skyscraper built on a logistical swamp. The truth of Namorsordentor. Imperial Japan's desperate struggle lay not in the hearts of its brave soldiers, but in the cold, unyielding balance sheets of global industry. Japan was a spiritual, military-obsessed culture, rooted in the rice fields and the worship of its ancient lineage, attempting to wage a modern war, World War II, against the world's foremost industrial titan norm. It was a contest of the sword against the steam hammer, of ritual against the relentless speed of the assembly line. Look past the uniforms, past the Banzai cries, and the true agonizing contradiction of the conflict was revealed in raw numbers. The United States had the capacity to produce 10 metric tons of steel for every single ton the Japanese Empire could forge. Steel, the bedrock of modern warfare, the necessary component for ships, tanks, guns, and ammunition, the very material that dictated the outcome of every skirmish, was arrayed against the Emperor's men at a crushing 10-to-1 ratio. The Japanese forces were fighting with a sword perpetually dulled by a simple lack of metal, a reality that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. And if steel was the body of the war, oil was the lifeblood, the essential fluid of speed and mobility. Tanaka's unit, like every element of the Imperial Army, operated under a constant, paralyzing awareness of scarcity. Their meager supply line delivered rotting rice, sometimes a single, rusty rifle for 3 men, and the knowledge that every bullet, every ounce of fuel, was a precious, irreplaceable commodity drawn from a rapidly diminishing pool. Japan, a nation virtually devoid of native oil reserves, had staked its entire campaign on a desperate, high-risk gambit to secure the finite fields of the Dutch East Indies. They were battling on a ration of existence. Across the Pacific, the picture was impossibly different. the Americans fought with unlimited resources. A nation sitting atop the gargantuan oil reservoirs of Texas and Oklahoma, capable of refining a virtually unlimited flow of high-octane aviation fuel and diesel. The disparity was so vast, it defied tactical sense. For every boat or 10 gallons of fuel, the Japanese could manage to refine and deliver through a submarine dodging relentless patrols. The American industrial machine could produce 1,000, easily, wastefully, relentlessly. This was the unheralded, unapologetic engine of the Allied supremacy. The juxtaposition on Guadalcanal was a physical manifestation of this global imbalance. Tanaka carried a tattered bag containing a handful of moldy rice balls, his strength depleted by malaria and months of hunger. He saw a few hundred feet away the perimeter of the American line. He didn't know the full data, but his senses screamed the truth. The Americans were sitting behind fortifications built of gleaming, new steel girder, not scavenged wood. Their rifles were clean, their uniforms intact. He could hear, even now, the distant rhythmic clanging of American engineers building yet another supply depot, their effort fueled not by desperate zeal, but by coffee, canned ham, and cigarettes. Luxuries utterly unimaginable to a fighting man in the Emperor's service. Their war was easy in its materials, which only confirmed the Japanese ideological belief that they were soft, spoiled, and ripe for the sickle of the true warrior. But this was the central, terrible mistake of Imperial Japan, the fundamental tyranny that would consume the entire effort. This war, the war Tanaka was about to charge into, would not be won by courage or ideology. It would be won by gallons of fuel, tons of steel, and the velocity of the American assembly line. The relentless, heartbreaking reality of the conflict was that it was a simple, brutal mathematics of destruction, determined not by who was willing to die, but by which nation could afford to simply outproduce and become its enemy. The thesis of this entire conflict was simple, cold, and utterly unforgiving. The nation that could produce 1,000 gallons of fuel for every 10 that its enemy could refine was the nation that had already won before the first shot was even fired. Sergeant Major Tanaka and his men were about to be consumed by an avalanche of steel and lead, created not by ogres, but by an assembly line, and the disturbing moment of realization would begin when the fanatical soldier saw the truth of the American machine not in its cruelty, but in its unthinkable, casual abundance. The rhythmic, desperate pace of the Banzai charge knit on the perimeter of Saipan was not a human attack, it was a physical dissolution. It began with a scream, a visceral, massed exhalation of final, fanatical defiance, but it was quickly swallowed by a roar that was purely mechanical, a sound that spoke only of gross tonnage and high-velocity ballistics. For Sergeant Major Kenjiro Tanaka, plunging through the darkness and the tangled wire, the battle was not an engagement of man versus man, but a solitary fight against an avalanche of steel and lead. A batastas like a thunderclap that ripped the air itself into strips of noise and shrapnel. The ideological firewall that promised victory through spirit now met the cold, hard mathematics of the American logistical machine head on, and the result was annihilation. The Americans did not merely defend, they buried. They did not fire, they unleashed a tidal wave of metal that turned the human body into pulp and the jungle floor into churned, smoking earth. The disciplined Japanese soldier was trained to fire his Type 99 rifle with the utmost economy, to make every round count, his life governed by the necessity of the 10-round clip. This was a scarcity born of weak industry and failing supply lines, masked as noble self-control. Tanaka's mind, even amidst the chaos, instinctively counted his remaining rounds, a ritual of desperation. But facing him was the terrifying, unrestrained excess of the .2 Browning heavy machine gun. The weapon did not fire bullets. It sprayed a continuous, contemptuous stream of death at a rate of 3,000 rounds per minute. Its noise a primal, unforgiving bass note in the symphony of slaughter. Tanaka did not see American faces in the gloom. He saw only the flashing muzzles, the relentless rhythmic heartbeat of an enemy that could afford to simply discard ammunition by the truckload. His entire belief system, that this war was about the noble discipline of the spirit, was being physically liquidated by an industrialized, almost casual wastefulness. This was the meat grinder, and the meat was the Japanese soldier. Then, amidst the hurricane of fire, a detail so trivial and counterintuitive that it cracked Tanaka's consciousness wider than any bullet, a moment that completely contradicted the propaganda of the single-minded, rapacious monster, a sliver of unexplainable soft material comfort. Appeared. A young American Marine, positioned behind a half-track, his helmet tilted back, paused in the brief lull between mortar salvos. He did not reload. He did not tend to a wound. He simply reached down into a canvas bag, pulled out a large, tin can, and with a casual, almost bored flick of a small knife, cracked it open. The noise was audible even over the receding artillery. The Marine then, still fully exposed to sporadic incoming fire, began to eat. He did not eat a hardened ration block or a strip of dried meat. He was consuming something soft, glistening, and luxurious. From the can with a small spoon, it was fruit. Peaches, suspended in syrup, a sweetness and a frivolous expenditure of resources utterly alien to a fighting man who had not tasted fresh food in 3 months. Here, under the threat of sudden death, was a man prioritizing a fleeting, meaningless moment of material pleasure. The propaganda had painted the Americans as ruthless, soulless killers. But ruthless, soulless killers do not stop an inch from the fray to savor canned fruit. This minor, inexplicable act of abundance was the first shard of reality to penetrate Tanaka's ideological armor. Moments later, a white-hot hammer struck his thigh, the impact sending him spinning into the dirt, the smell of burnt flesh mixing with the damp earth. His world narrowed to the searing, agonizing pain. His comrades, those who hadn't been vaporized by the M2's stream, faded into the darkness. He tried to crawl, to reach his own bayonet for the ritualistic final, honorable act, but his leg was useless, the bone shattered. Silence descended, not the peaceful quiet of the grave, but the absolute, predatory silence of an enemy securing the field. Strong hands, large and smelling faintly of soap and tobacco, hauled him roughly, but not maliciously, from the shell crater. Sergeant Major Kenjiro Tanaka, the man who believed surrender was the greatest dishonor, was a prisoner, his mind still operating on the dictates of the Bushido code, raced ahead to the inevitable conclusion. The ritualistic torture, the slow dismemberment, the humiliation his superiors had so graphically described. He braced himself, closing his eyes, awaiting the first cruel blow, the first moment of terror that would confirm the American as the monster. He expected to be flayed alive and used for target practice, but the first sensation was not pain. It was the clean, almost clinical touch of a soft cloth wiping the grime from his wound. He opened his eyes, squinting against the beam of a small, focused flashlight. An American corpsman. A young man with a neatly shaven face and an expression of impersonal, detached professionalism, was kneeling over him. There was no hatred in his eyes, no fanaticism, only the focused attention of a mechanic dealing with a broken machine. The corpsman efficiently trimmed away the tomba, shredded cloth, cleaned the wound with an iodine solution that stung sharply, and then the final, profound irony that shattered Tanaka's internalized reality. The corpsman opened a small, sterile white packet and applied a generous, smooth layer of acetyl sulfa powder, the powerful new Tiaba antibiotics, before wrapping the wound in a thick, clean, sterile bandage. The expected monster had not tortured him. He had medicated him. The propaganda had promised the Japanese soldier that their enemies were soulless materialists, incapable of honor. Yet here was a man, bound by a medical code, expending precious, industrially produced medicine on the very soldier who had just tried to kill him. This was the first true shock. The monstrous enemy was not fueled by sadism, but by a sense of material privilege so profound that it could afford, even in the heart of combat, to be finite, clean, efficient, and bound by a code of medical care. The ideological firewall was not overcome by fire. It was slowly, surgically, and devastatingly breached by the unnecessary kindness of abundance. The long, jarring truck ride from the beachhead terminated not in a place of torment, but a landscape of unthinkable, alien order. Sergeant Major Kenjiro Tanaka, leaning heavily on a crutch fashioned by his captors, found himself blinking in the harsh sunlight of a rear area prisoner of war processing camp, likely deep behind the front lines on a remote Pacific Island base. The transformation from the jungle's chaos was instant and jarring. Here, the ground was neatly graded, the tents were uniform, and the air was not thick with the stink of gunpowder and dysentery, but with the faint, unsettling aroma of chlorine, fresh lumber, and frying fat. Around him, his captured comrades, men who had starved for the emperor and whose gaunt frames bore the scars of fanatical belief, moved with the shuffling uncertainty of men whose reality had just been violently redefined. They were malnourished and scarred. They expected the promised humiliation, but what they were presented with was a far more subtle and ultimately more devastating form of psychological warfare. The sheer, unadulterated spectacle of American plenty. The truth of the conflict was laid bare, not in a lecture hall, but in the overwhelming sight of the Fordham main supply depot. Tanaka's eyes, trained to find meaning in every minute detail of warfare, fixated on the endless rows of perfectly stacked, perfectly labeled crates. This was not the meager, desperate accumulation of necessary supplies. This was a vast, arrogant sea of abundance. He saw not the anticipated boxes of dried hardtack, or the meager, salted fish that constituted the entirety of the Imperial soldiers' diet. Instead, he saw towering palisades of kyoto-tosh, canned meats, shiny tinfoil packets of cigarettes, bricks of chocolate bars, and the legendary, ubiquitous sea ration pourpoint boxes, stacked so high they seemed to mock the gravity that held Tanaka's starving body to the earth. The realization began to bloom in his mind. The sheer volume was the weapon. The enemy did not struggle. The enemy wasted. The numbers, unsaid but manifest in the physical world before him, were the true, terrifying factors statistical reveal. The Imperial soldier was taught to survive on meager calorie counts and to conserve every resource, but the Americans, Tanaka slowly grasped, measured their logistics in tens of millions. The narrator's chilling, authoritative voice echoed the silent data that crushed the Japanese spirit. The American war machine produced 10 million K rations every month. A number that defied comprehension, representing a volume of food that could have fed the entire Imperial army for a year, simply tossed away to fuel the personal convenience of their forward troops. More terrifying still was the ultimate energy source, the lifeblood of their mobility. The Allied war effort, driven by the limitless fields of Texas, consumed a staggering 1.8 billion barrels of oil. Over the course of the conflict, this was the source of the avalanche that buried Tanaka's comrades. This was the true nature of the monster. It was not fueled by malice, but by unlimited capacity. The Kamwaman scale of production itself became a new kind of terror, a knowledge that spoke of an inevitable, predestined defeat. The shock transitioned from the external landscape of the depot to the immediate, visceral experience of the POW barracks. The first true moment of doubt came not from an interrogation, but from the simple, overwhelming sight of the facilities provided. Here was no pestilential, open latrine trench, but a room with white porcelain bowls. And running water, a luxury utterly unimaginable to even a high-ranking officer on the front. Here were beds that were not woven mats on bare earth, but actual canvas cots with blankets and, most shockingly, clean white sheets. The monster, it turned out, lived in a world of comfort and cleanliness. An industrialized commitment to hygiene that spoke volumes about its fundamental priorities. Then came the first full American meal. Not the ritualized starvation that had defined their existence, the meager rice gruel and boiled weeds, but eggs, crisp bacon, white bread, and coffee. That steamed in tin mugs. The men ate with a ferocity born of months of deprivation, yet even as they gorged, their eyes were wide with incomprehension. The abundance was not a trick, it was simply the expected, baseline reality of the American system. This was the first, forced, reprogramming of Tanaka's reality. The enemy, who was supposed to be rapacious and evil, was merely well-fed and industrially supported. Later, sitting against a barracks wall, Tanaka was offered a cigarette by a young American guard, a man whose face was placid and unburdened. The sergeant major, through a halting translator, asked the single defining question, the question that went to the heart of the contrasting ideologies. Why do you fight this war? For your emperor? For your spirit? The guard, a simple man from Ohio, exhaled a plume of rich tobacco smoke, regarded the ruined Japanese veteran, and offered a reply that was both unheroic and infinitely powerful. In its simplicity, I fight to go home. It was a profound philosophical collision. Tanaka and his men were fighting for the fanatical, spiritual concept of ultimate self-sacrifice. For the emperor, the American was fighting for the most basic, materialistic goal. The return to his wife, his job, and his comfortable American life. The American goal was supported by the entire limitless capacity of the industrial machine. It was a goal backed by 10 million rations a month and the consumption of billions of barrels of oil. The Japanese goal of fighting until the last man was revealed in that moment to be a desperate, spiritual plea against the crushing certainty of industrialized reality. The disturbing moment was the realization that the Americans did not need a fanatic spirit to win. They simply needed their paychecks and their comfortable beds. And the simplicity of that goal, backed by the unthinkable, alien abundance of the world's greatest logistical network, made them utterly unstoppable. The contrast was not merely industrial, it was deeply, profoundly cultural. A collision of worldviews that played out in the mundane, sun-drenched yards of the prisoner of war camp. Here, the true nature of the American machine was revealed. It was not a monolith of hate, but a complex, administratively burdened system built to serve millions of ordinary men. For Dodor, Lieutenant William Bill Davies, the young intelligence officer assigned to the task of processing the captured zealots, the war had become a battle not against fanaticism, but against paperwork and pestilence. Davies had been trained to view the Japanese soldier as an uncompromising ideologue, a self-propelled missile of the imperial will. Yet, the men shuffling before him were not the demonic figures of military intelligence briefings. They were skeletal individuals, ravaged by scurvy, dysentery, and advanced malnutrition, human wreckage requiring extraordinary amounts of medicine and comfort. Davies's internal struggle was not defined by the roar of the M2 Browning port, but by the silent, bureaucratic nightmare of the Boomen, logistics of humanity. He spent his days fighting with army quartermasters, not for more bullets, but for Japanese language books, struggling to fulfill the almost absurdly formal stipulations of the Geneva Convention. This document, an entire volume of international legalism governing the humane treatment of captured soldiers, was a concept utterly foreign to the Imperial Army, which had summarily dismissed it as "briofotomt," irrelevant, Western weakness. Davies was tasked with providing his prisoners with a level of respect, legalism, and material care that his own captured countrymen in Japanese hands were absolutely and systematically denied. The irony was a constant low-grade hum of cognitive dissonance. He was fighting a war against an enemy that believed in total annihilation, while simultaneously having to argue for extra rations of tinned fruit and wash for that very enemy. The very act of adherence to the convention demonstrated a level of material privilege, the resources, time, and administrative overhead that Japan simply did not possess. Inside the compound, the captive Japanese soldiers, including Sergeant Major Tanaka, were undergoing a profound, silent conversion. The propaganda of the monstrous, bloodthirsty enemy shattered every day before the most benign sights. The prisoners spent hours observing their guards. They saw them laughing raucously during baseball games played under the hot sun, their movements clumsy and human. They saw them slouching carelessly in their chairs, reading paperback novels whose plots concerned women, jobs, and home mortgages, concerns utterly divorced from the purity of martial struggle. Most damningly, they saw them gathered around simple wooden tables, meticulously writing long letters. These were not soulless automatons. They were individuals with emotional attachments. Men for whom the war was an inconvenient, temporary disruption to a comfortable, established life waiting for them. The American war machine, Tanaka realized, was not a single ideological spear driven by a fanatical doctrine. It was millions of ordinary, simple men, connected to an incomprehensibly vast industrial and logistical support system that allowed them the time, the comfort, and the emotional space to remain fully human. Then came the second major reveal, the small, perfect act that finally delivered the emotional blow and initiated the disturbing moment of realization. One of the newly captured Japanese prisoners, a boy of 18, was succumbing quickly to advanced beriberi. He was too weak to consume the solid food offered. Sergeant First Class Robert Bobby Jenkins, a large, laconic MP from Kansas, knelt by the boy's cot. Jenkins was a man who handled his duties with a weary professionalism, neither kind nor cruel. But today, he did something utterly unexpected, and, from a Japanese ideological standpoint, catastrophic. He did not offer C-ration coffee. He reached into a personal cooler, one reserved for the American mess, and retrieved a bionic glass bottle of fresh, chilled milk. He carefully helped the sick Japanese soldier drink, holding the boy's head with a paternal tenderness that was completely devoid of malice or political motivation. The act itself was small, simple, and utterly unnecessary. The boy was the enemy. Jenkins was under no obligation to share his own personal, perishable supply of a difficult-to-transport luxury. Yet he did. It was not the ritualistic torture Tanaka had been promised by his officers. It was the pure, unthinking humanity of a well-fed, comfortable society that broke the remaining fragments of his ideological framework. The realization struck Tanaka with the force of a physical blow. The American was not a monster. He was simply a boku, normal man of overwhelming material privilege. The true terror was not in the enemy's hatred, but in their normality, a normalcy so deeply supported by an industrial base that they could afford to dispense unnecessary kindness to their enemies. The Americans had the resources to fight a total war while remaining men of peace, men who worried about their families and who drank fresh milk. The Midotum, doctrine of the invincible spirit, had taught Tanaka that his enemy was weak because of its comfort. The POW camp taught him the horrifying truth. Their comfort was their strength, and their abundance was their unstoppable shield. The realization was a devastating, total defeat of the soul. The ultimate fate of Sergeant Major Kenjiro Tanaka was not decided by the shriek of a bullet or the thrust of a bayonet, but in the cold, unyielding silence of a bihruak, ledger book, kept thousands of miles away, a final, authoritative analysis that revealed how high industrial capacity and logistical supremacy were the true, inevitable victors over the Japanese spiritual doctrine. The long, authoritative sentences of history now write the final truth, revealing that the entirety of the conflict was a grand, terrible juxtaposition. Spirit versus the gross national product. A spiritual conviction attempting to defy the crushing reality of mass production. Tanaka, observing the ceaseless, organized flow of American supplies, the casual waste that was the envy of the entire world, had inadvertently gained a terrible clarity, a realization that the war had been lost, not by a failure of courage, but by a failure of arithmetic. The most agonizing difference, the one that condemned entire Japanese divisions to oblivion, was the staggering American capacity for immediate replacement and recovery. A capacity built on an industrial base that was essentially inexhaustible. When a United States Marine division suffered 30% casualties in a brutal island campaign, the colossal industrial and logistical infrastructure ensured that within 4 weeks, the division was fully resupplied with new weapons, new uniforms, and most critically, fully trained, fresh personnel, ready to re-enter the fight as if the prior defeat had been a minor inconvenience. The Japanese equivalent, struggling with crumbling supply lines and a desperate lack of materials and training capacity, would take, say, 6 months to reconstitute a similar unit, and the replacements arriving were frequently untrained boys, mere meat for the slaughter, rushed from high school classrooms to be fed into the industrial meat grinder of the Pacific. The Imperial military, therefore, was not fighting a traditional war of attrition. It was fighting a war of finite resources against an enemy that could simply print more airplanes and mine more ships than the Earth itself could sink. A power that treated its losses not as a crippling deficit, but as a momentary delay in the relentless forward movement of its gross national product. This devastating equation was most clearly illustrated in the sky, where the chivalry of the Japanese fighter pilot met the unforgiving geometry of American engineering. The iconic Mitsubishi Zero, a lightweight, beautiful, and initially mythical machine, was structurally designed to prioritize speed and agility, making it a featherweight, delicate jewel of a plane. It was a design philosophy that implicitly accepted the pilot's potential sacrifice, making the aircraft a statistically and structurally single-use weapon. In direct contrast stood the American Grumman F-6, F. Hellcatork, a corpulent, heavily armored, tough-to-kill machine, built with a singular, unapologetic purpose: to protect its pilot. This deliberate design decision meant the Hellcat could absorb hundreds of rounds of enemy fire, take its pilot safely back to the carrier deck, and often be ready to fly again the next day. The technical realization of the Japanese defeat was profound and cold. The Americans fought a war where they could afford to save the pilot, the most valuable asset, while the Japanese were fighting a war where they were forced, by necessity and doctrine, to sacrifice the pilot, replacing skill with fanaticism. And the industrial reality that drove this disparity was that the American carriers upon which those Hellcats landed could be built and deployed in a mind-boggling 6 days, while Japan struggled for 6 months to repair a single damaged vessel. Tanaka, watching the effortless movements of his guards and the endless arrival of new supplies, felt the spiritual anchor of his entire life being violently pulled from the earth. The realization of the futility of the Montor divine Windfaltabound strategy, the final desperate hope of his emperor, was no longer a question of courage. It was a simple matter of recognizing the industrial scale. The Americans were not evil. They were simply too big, too rich, too capable. A force that had transcended the simple constraints of human conflict. He grasped that his entire life, the sacrifice of his comrades, and his unwavering belief in the doctrine of the invincible spirit were mathematically irrelevant before the industrial might of a foe that could produce a Liberty ship every 52 days, a vessel whose purpose was simply to carry more of the incomprehensible abundance, the Bushido Code. The noble structure of loyalty and sacrifice that had defined his world had finally and completely lost to the Ford Motor Company's assembly line. His entire purpose, measured against the billions of barrels of oil and the millions of tons of steel, was less than a rounding error. The great tragic truth was the quiet acceptance that the fight was over before it began, decided not by men, but by the cold, unfeeling data of industrial supremacy. The long shadow of defeat, cast by the sheer height of American industrial stacks, settled over the shattered landscape of Japan. Sergeant Major Kenjiro Tanaka, a man whose entire moral and physical universe had collapsed in a prisoner of war camp, defined by clean sheets and fresh milk, was finally released in the late 1940s. He returned to a ruined, demoralized, and starving nation, a place where the emperor's divine mandate had given way to the brutal, undeniable reality of the Allied occupation. The same logistical pipelines that had delivered the overwhelming avalanche of destruction, the endless stream of gasoline, the massive tonnage of ammunition, the relentless output of the Hellcat factories, were now, in the ultimate, profound irony, repurposed to deliver economic and humanitarian aid. This was the final irony, the inescapable paradox that redefined the Japanese consciousness. The populace, who had been fed a diet of propaganda promising monstrous, rapacious occupiers, were now confronted with the same unthinkable abundance that had bewildered the POWs. The arrival of massive shipments of American spam, powdered milk, essential medical supplies, and most significantly, the kyor, technological know-how embedded in the occupation, were the seeds of their future. Japan was not merely defeated by industrial capacity, it was, in the deepest sense, saved by the same force. The overwhelming American production, initially leveraged to destroy, was now deployed to reconstruct, laying the essential, material foundation for Japan's post-war economic miracle. The spiritual war had been lost, but the physical nation was being resurrected by the very materialistic power it had once scorned. Tanaka and his comrades became the silent, uncomfortable prophets of this new world order. They were the few who understood the true scale of the power that had defeated them. Their knowledge of the mantarboifant, American table, the effortless availability of food, the comfort of the mantartomba, American bed, and the puban, casual, profound humanity extended by the guards, made them living refutations of the Imperial doctrine. They understood, in a way no civilian could, that the war had never been lost on the battlefield in a glorious, desperate final charge, but in the factories of Detroit and the oil fields of Texas. The failure of the Boisson Type 99 rifle was a failure of the national steel quota. The loss of the E0 was a failure to produce sufficient aluminum and high-octane fuel. Tanaka was one of the few who had witnessed the logistical supremacy that underwrote the seemingly gentle nature of the foe, realizing that their kindness was a byproduct of their capability. The ultimate truth, therefore, must be delivered with the final, cold precision of a ledger entry. The war was never truly about which nation possessed the greatest aspirators or the most fervent doctrine of self-sacrifice. It was, instead, a contest determined by which nation could afford to be the most humanely inefficient. The nation that possessed the colossal logistical wealth to treat its prisoners well, to feed its soldiers richly and without ration, and to armor its planes and ships so thoroughly that its human capital was protected rather than expended. The Japanese military believed, with every fiber of its fanatical being, that it was fighting a war of spirit against materialism. They were catastrophically wrong. They were fighting a war of 1925's industrial base against 1944's logistics. And in that cruel, cold, unfeeling arithmetic, there could only be one outcome. The quiet, self-assured laughter in the American camp was never mocking or malicious. It was merely the unconscious, secure confidence of unlimited resources.